once again from the studios of UNO Television on the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Consider this, a program of issues and information behind today's news.
The president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, annexed part of Ukraine, ignoring the warnings of President Obama. In an emotional speech, Putin said Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula has always been an integral part of Russia in the hearts and minds of people. Putin sent troops into Crimea this month after the president of Ukraine, a Putin ally, was overthrown in a revolt. Most in Crimea are of Russian descent, and over the weekend they voted to join Russia.
Hi everyone, I'm Kathy Wyatt. Welcome to this week's edition of Consider This. Our topic, Ukraine. Joining us to talk more about it are Tom Gouttierre, Senior Officer for Global Engagement, Dean of International Studies and Programs, and Director for the Center of Afghanistan Studies at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Seated next to him is Davis Florick. Davis is completing his graduate degree in the East-West Studies program at Creighton University. Welcome to the two of you. Thank you for being here.
Good to be with you again.
All right, Tom, let's start with a brief history of Ukraine.
Well, I think the most important part of that is that Ukraine has long been coveted by nations to the west and east, particularly Germany and Russia, and there's been a lot of fighting over the years. I think it is most came into the news perhaps to those who look to that part of East Central Europe during the years prior to the Second War, when Stalin was the head of the Soviet Union. Ukraine was part of that, and he forced a lot of Ukrainians to be moved to different parts of the Soviet Union in his social engineering programs. Many Ukrainians, millions, died in this process. So there's this feeling within Ukraine that they haven't fared so well. And then in came Hitler and his troops, and many in the Ukraine welcomed the opportunity to be separated from Stalin and the Soviet Union. And then again, as Germany was being defeated, back comes the Soviet Union. And so this is a very, very uncomfortable situation. In the mid-50s, Nikita Khrushchev, who was, I think, sensitive to this, he had Ukrainian ties in his own blood, made a kind of generous gesture and provided to the Ukrainian Republic, which was then, of course, a part of the Soviet Union. Never did he think, or anyone else, that Ukraine would become an independent nation. And so he turned over the Crimea to Ukraine as a way to show reparation, in a sense, at least social and emotional reparation, for the mishandling and mistreatment of Ukrainians by his predecessors. So then in 1991, in December, the Soviet Union imploded, came apart, and all of a sudden Ukraine was an independent nation, a new independent state. And it had the Crimea with it. Of course, Russians bristled at that, and as you know from stories we've seen on the news and comments that have been made, Putin really looked very, very emotionally at the fall of the Soviet Union as a tremendous defeat. And I think now he sees this as a way, in some ways, to regain some of the emotional losses by also some physical gains, and by taking over this former part of what many Russians believe is integral to the Russian nation.
Right, so where are we as we sit here today? The story is changing, so what is the current?
Well, I mean, President Putin has indeed called for and got a vote to annex Crimea. It's now, for all intents and purposes, and surely in the minds of the Russians and him, a part of Russia and no longer a part of Ukraine. I know many Ukrainians probably don't agree with that. Apparently the European Union nations and the United States, NATO nations, don't feel this was a legitimate effort or process. Certainly the nations that border Russia and Ukraine are very, very apprehensive. They feel that they may in some way or another be next because there are parts of them, particularly nations in the Baltic area, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, that have large numbers of Russians in their population, Moldova, another, and so many of them are wondering what Putin might do next. I think as the Sochi Games came to a conclusion, nobody at that time would have in any way predicted that a month later we would be seeing these kinds of headlines relating to Putin and Russia. Russia was riding kind of high. The Sochi Olympics really turned out to be quite well done, even though they were the most expensive in history. And so this is a real unpredictable kind of situation. And so where do we stand now? I don't think anybody really knows what Vladimir Putin might do next. Would he give instructions to go into other parts of Ukraine where there are large populations, again, of Russian-speaking Ukrainians who also have a dual passport, Russian and Ukrainian? Some people suggest that he might be thinking of that, going right up to the river that separates the heavily Ukrainian populated part of the Ukraine from the heavily Russian populated part of Ukraine. So I think we'll just have to see where we're going to go on that.
Wow. Davis, much has been said here. What are you thinking as Tom is introducing this topic for us today?
Well, I think it's interesting. We look at Crimea today, and really, if you go back to the 1897 census, the Crimean Peninsula, the demographics of the Crimean Peninsula were about 33% Russian, ethnic Russian, 11% ethnic Ukrainian, and 35% ethnic Tatar. And really, about 1897 through 1989, there was a sort of social engineering experiment done by the Russian imperialists under the Tsars and the Soviet Union. As Dr. Gouttierre mentioned earlier, the Russians try to bring in port facilities to the Crimean Peninsula. They try to bring in different tourism and vacation resorts to the Crimean Peninsula. And what that essentially did was increase the Russian population as a percentage of the overall ethnic composition of the peninsula. The other thing is, and as the doctor mentioned earlier, you look at the Tatars in 1944, when the Soviet Union moved back west, they were pushing the Germans back. Stalin accused them of collaborating with the Germans, and so he evicted them and he sent them to Uzbekistan. And so what ended up happening was, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, the Russians had a artificial majority, had a disproportional population on the peninsula. You go to the 1989 census, and the Russian population on the peninsula was right around 68-69%, the Ukrainians were around 25%, the Tatars around 1%. Fast forward to 2001, and the population was around 58% Russian, 24% Ukrainian, 12% Tatar. And so I look at the election today, the referendum that happened on March 16th, the 95% supposed victory for secession and potential joining Russia. And I would compare the legitimacy of that, I would equate the legitimacy of that to a lot like Kim Jong-un's victory. His recent victory is 100% unanimous victory. It shouldn't really come as any surprise when you consider that for the Ukrainian or the Crimean legislature weeks before, when they had their own referendum on secession, the ethnic Ukrainian Tatar legislators, the ones that would have sympathized with staying with Ukraine, were asked not to participate. So, in general, what I would just simply say is, you look at the demographics in the most recent censuses and their trends towards more flatlining, less of a simple majority for the Russian minority, and you compare that with the vote, and really what you're talking about is the entire Ukrainian and Tatar minority groups would have had to have voted for secession, and I just don't see that as being a realistic option, of being something that would have happened. So, and you look at the lack of international observers, the lack of any quote transparency, the processes and procedures that were in place for the election, and I would question the legitimacy of it.
Well, Tom, he's a student. How's he doing so far?
Very well.
Yeah, Davis, we were talking a little bit before the program. Why this area for you?
Well, to be honest, it's always been, Eastern Europe has always been something that has intrigued me. It's when I was a child, my father worked at the Pentagon as an arms control negotiator. He did plenty of things with Eastern Europe and Central Europe. It's something that, some of my earliest memories as a child were talking about the Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian conflict, the conflict in the former Yugoslavia. So this is an area that I think matters. It's an area that has permanence. It has staying power. It's something that's relevant to today. Even, we haven't mentioned, and Dr. Gouttierre mentioned it earlier, we talked about Moldova and the Transnistria region and how the Supreme Soviet in the region, their small government, they have asked Putin to take a look at annexing them just this week. And so I think what interests me in Eastern Europe and Central Europe and really the former Soviet Union, all the republics, is just the possibilities, the opportunities, the transformative situations that exist in that region today, and it still has relevance, and it matters.
Okay. Tom, you said just a few minutes ago you're not really sure where this is headed. I would imagine, though, that you have some sort of thought on all of this in terms of direction here in the near future and what that might do long term.
Well, I think the first thing that we may be watching will be the types and degree of sanctions which the Western European nations and the U.S. will levy against Russia. And I think depending on how those are, we might see varying degrees of reaction and response from Russia, from Putin, and even from individuals in the areas of countries like Moldova, where the population has this micro-nationalistic ethnic language sectarian divide, and see how emotions play into all of this. There may be many in Ukraine's eastern areas, as I intimated earlier, that may ask for the same kind of thing that Davis was suggesting that some of the Moldovans had. So one cannot construct a calendar that will have any really validity in terms of such dramatic geopolitical events, but certainly what we can, I feel, understand is that this is not going to become any more calm than it is right now, any calmer than it is now. This is a very volatile thing because it's based on emotional, sectarian, linguistic, ethnic ties, and those are always in situations like this, when you have an individual like Putin, who himself obviously is being driven by emotional considerations. Here's a man much like Adolf Hitler, who's been suffering in his own mind, has this tremendous angst about the way the rest of the world, as he saw it, was treating the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, when it came apart, just like Hitler felt the way the Europeans, and particularly the French, treated Germany after the Treaty of Versailles and after the First World War. And then what did Hitler do? His first thing is he violated that treaty and put troops in the Rhineland, which had been demilitarized, and shortly thereafter he had troops marching into the Sudetenland. The pretext was the same, linguistic national identity. These were Germans, and they needed protection, just like Putin said, these are Russians, they need protection. And then the next step, like Putin's kind of Russian Anschluss, this is a German word for coming in and bringing together the German speakers in Austria. We know that story most familiarly with The Sound of Music. The Van Trapp family was fleeing from this combination under Hitler. But that's what happened, and this is now what Putin has done. So it's very interesting. People say, well, we can't compare this to what Hitler did. Well, we can't compare Putin to Hitler on a number of areas, but we can compare and find valid arguments that this is indeed the same kind of thing that he's done. It's also the same thing that Saddam Hussein did in 1980 when he marched into another country, similar kinds of claims, Kuwait. And in that particular situation, the whole world, under the leadership of the United States, but with a UN flag, gathered together and marched in, took Kuwait back. And so I don't think we're going to see that kind of military action, obviously, in Ukraine, but something will have to happen. And now we're going to see what kind of leadership President Obama is able to provide or not provide to the Western Alliance, how much of an impact this is going to have on an individual who obviously has some kind of great testosterone element about him. He's always running around bare-chested, without his shirt, flexing his muscles and stuff. And whether or not this will have an impact ultimately on the economy of Russia that might turn events within Russia into another direction. So these are all complicated, as you suggest, elements that make whatever goes forth volatile for the region and volatile for the world's economy. Putin isn't thinking in terms of advantages that he and his country might have gained had there been closer relations with the European Union. So in a globalized 21st century, there are advantages to be taken in terms of economic development and exchange, education, things of this nature. He's acting more like a 19th century imperial despot who is playing 19th century imperial power politics. And so in some ways that means he's misplaced. He's in the wrong century, but certainly not in the minds of the Russians. He's a heroic figure right now in Russia for what he has done.
Thank you. Davis, thoughts?
Well, if I may, I agree with what Tom had said, but I'd like to bring up 3 points I think that are relevant to this. First of all, you look at what President Putin has done in Ukraine to date. It's very similar to what he did in Georgia in 2008, where he basically had non-attributional forces that went into Georgia, to South Ossetia and Abkhazia. They instigated a number of provocative actions, armed conflict even with the Georgian military. When that happened, he was able to bring in Russian forces and he was able to assert control, assert sovereignty over South Ossetia and Abkhazia. If you look at the Ukraine today, and you can paint it in kind of you can visualize it in sort of an escalation ladder, almost a hill. Early on, President Putin was able to use what were essentially non-attributional forces to gain control of the airports in Crimea. He was able to then bring in Russian military forces. In the last couple of days, he's crossed the isthmus to secure some pipelines, some natural gas pipelines. There's been a shooting with once again these unmarked, unidentifiable soldiers shooting a naval officer on a Ukrainian base. There was, we had in the last 24, 48 hours, Ukrainian base was actually overrun, and the naval officers that were at the post were forced to leave. So, as you look at moving forward here, the interesting question I would have would basically be, I suspect that President Putin is willing to stop at the Crimean Peninsula. I think if he could gain that, he might be willing to say, okay, I'm good for now. But if for instance he's able to continue on this provocative path, and the Ukrainians respond with an armed confrontation, or if something were to occur in the eastern part of the Ukraine, what would happen? I believe the answer is that the Russian military would look at collecting part of the eastern part of the Ukraine, or perhaps doing some other taking over the entire country and installing some sort of regime there. And I would like to mention the Crimean Peninsula, I think, is a separate issue. I think it's de-linked in a lot of ways from the eastern part of the Ukraine, simply because even if you look back at the 2001 census, the population on the Crimean, the ethnic Russian population on the Crimean Peninsula was a majority. It's not in the eastern part of the country. And so in The Economist, in the 8 March edition, even they're mentioning that the Russians on the eastern side are being encouraged. They're being provided assistance to cross the border, and essentially they are being encouraged to instigate different actions on the Ukrainian side. That's why you see some of these small demonstrations. But I do think it's worth noting, if the ethnic Russian population across the country was chafing under the way things have played out over the last few months, the military, I think, would have been more impacted, because it also is representative of the demographics of the entire country, and it appears as though they are fairly uniform in support of the new government. When you start talking about President Obama and his policies, I think he's in a tight position right now, simply because there just isn't a great appetite for forcibly removing the Russians from the Crimean Peninsula. So I think sanctions today are an appropriate step. I think they are a good mechanism. They're something that's worth taking a look at. The only concerns I simply have with sanctions are, one, what happens as sanctions pull on? What happens if they don't have the effect that the Europeans and the Americans are looking for? At what point does Crimea joining Russia become not just practice, but it becomes a law of sorts? It's a permanent thing. The second issue I would have with sanctions is, if President Putin crosses over the borders, what do you do when this current sanction regime looks like it isn't working? What kind of response do the Americans have? And then the only other point I would mention, broadly, is for Eastern Europeans, for other American allies, partners, and friends, our responsibility, I think, in a large degree, is to guarantee their safety and security. I think that's been the case for quite a number of years, and while people question our ability to do that, I look at the Poles, the Hungarians, the Slovaks, the Baltic states, as Dr. mentioned earlier, and how they view the problem in the Ukraine, what kind of trepidation they have. I look at our ability to deter potential adversaries, potential foes, and what they're learning from what's going on, what's taking place today in the Ukraine, and where I would parallel today's incidences in the Ukraine, and where I would say that this is a precedent that sets up kind of where the Obama administration is able to maneuver, is in East Asia, the Asia Pacific region, and just simply how does Xi Jinping interpret what's going on in the Ukraine today, and what does this mean for places like the Diaoyu Islands? What does this mean elsewhere in territorial disputes on that side of the world? And it's for President Putin specifically, though, he has to be, I think, very careful here in terms of what kind of precedents for territorial disputes does he set up. All across his borders, there are historical and ongoing territorial issues, not to mention separatist movements inside of his borders, and how he's able to manage all of this to both achieve his goals in the Ukraine, but also to ensure that he doesn't cause problems for himself down the road. I think that'll be a very interesting and very intriguing issue.
Tom, I want to hear a little bit more from you in terms of U.S. reaction, and we kind of put together all of this, the emotion and so forth, and our ability. I mean, are we able to respond? First of all, what did you think of how we responded, and are we able to really do what needs to be done in order for this to go the right way? Do we have that capability?
Well, I think to a certain degree we were a bit handcuffed just because of the territorial realities with which we were faced. An individual with a large army right next to another country which is remote from us, not a part of the NATO alliance, even though the NATO alliance is nearby, in Turkey as well as in the new member states in East Central Europe. It's a different kind of a thing in terms of mobility and timing. I think we're a little slow, and I think that Congress has to bear some of the blame for this in making a decision to provide military aid to the Ukrainian government. There was, and also additional money, there was some provided. as things escalated and seemed like they were moving the way they now have moved. There was discussion and debate about this, and also we really have not yet taken a forcible voice, let's say, in proclaiming what kind of sanctions we are going to levy. Maybe we were hoping, maybe our leaders have been hoping that there would be a pullback from the brink of this dangerous situation, but that doesn't appear to be going to be happening. So I'm still waiting myself to see what we're going to do. Angela Merkel is taking more of a leadership role in the whole idea of the sanctions, and are we, as everybody suggests, I think would be good for us to come out and strongly say there's no more G8, now there's a G7, Russia's out of that. Vice President Biden did go to Lithuania. That was a good thing, because I think the Lithuanians and the Latvians and Estonians are very concerned because they have these Russian minorities in the eastern parts of their countries, and so they are members of the European Union now and NATO, and so we've, I think, at least forcibly said that we are with you. I don't know, quite frankly, and I don't know that anybody else knows, quite frankly, that statement means yet, because we have not been very forcible in demonstrating or proclaiming what it is and to what degree we are with them. And I'm sure they're apprehensive. And I'm sure, as Davis has said, the Chinese are looking at this. So too is Bashar Assad in Syria. So too are the Iranians, because we're working with the Russians very closely on sanctions that relate to both of those countries, and for different reasons. And will we still have their partnership in this? That's very questionable. Right. And so there are many of these things that relate to what we may or may not do. And again, that's why I said earlier, we will now be watching what kind of leadership President Obama provides to the Western Alliance.
Wow, I suppose with so much else, time will tell. We need to keep our eyes and ears open to this issue. And gentlemen, I can't thank you enough for coming in to share your time and expertise to bring us up to speed. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You bet. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next week.
Nice.
Consider This is an issues and information program produced by UNO Television. More information can be found at unotv.unomaha.edu. If you'd like to share your comments about this show, call UNO TV at 402-554-2516 during regular business hours, or email us at considerthis@tvmail.unomaha.edu.